Modern Chinese Stories and Novellas, from 1919 to 1949. Edited by Joseph S. M. Lau, Hsia, and Liu Wufan Li. In the Hospital, by Ding Ling. December was almost gone. The seasoned snow had fallen, and the creeks and rivers were covered with ice. The wind blowing across the harvested hills made a rustling sound over the reed thatching of animal shelters and moaned before it rushed off along the bottom of the watercourse. A pheasant riding the thick grass arranged its feathers and squeezed into what was either a crevice in the rocks or a hole in the ground. Sunlight shining on the frozen piles of cattle and horse dung made a foul stench. A few flies crawled over them listlessly. Twilight came swiftly to the scene. In all its vastness it closed from every side, dropping down icily from the distant hills, sweeping silently from the barely visible horizon. Birds shivered, dogs pulled their tails closer to their bodies, men returned to their homes, to those cave dwellings that were their only shelter. While this was happening, a young woman in a gray cotton military uniform came walking along the road near the watercourse, following a man wearing a sheepskin greatcoat. The woman was very nimble, and this, along with the fact that she was wearing male clothing, made her look like a young boy. She deliberately wore a pleased expression. Opening her small black eyes wide, she looked happily at the bleakness on every side. "I haven't had any work experience. I'm so sure I'll be giving you a lot of trouble. I'll have to keep asking for your help to make sure everything is all right. You're an experienced revolutionary, Section Chief Li. Are you from the Hubei, Honan, Anhui area?" By now she was very good at this tone of voice. She felt that no matter what organization she went to, the first task to establish a good personal relationship with the maintenance personnel there. In school, she had used this flattering tone of voice every time she went into the kitchen to draw water or the communications section to pick up a letter. She also used it whenever she replenished the oil lamp or went to get charcoal. But she didn't strike one as being the least bit ingrating, just light-hearted and relaxed. Section Chief Li, the man walking in front of her, looked exactly like a general in his old sheepskin greatcoat. He had that not too demanding, yet not too relaxed manner of a typical administrative section chief. Sometimes such fellows appeared rather low-witted, but at other times they seemed very intelligent. If their personnel committed errors, they could use the most vulgar of soldiers' swear words, but they were also capable of unobtrusively sending a few chickens, some eggs, or some roasted pumpkin seeds to secretaries general or directors. These were small matters, though. Li's work with the masses was good, so there was no cause for any suspicion or jealousy. As they crossed from the far to the near side of the valley and passed through the watercourse, they caught a glimpse of a man dressed in white. Apparently trying to console herself, the woman heaved a heavy sigh and said, "What a lovely, quiet place for convalescing." The woman did not dare to view this place too optimistically, yet neither did she dare to think that this life would be too terrible. Despair and frustration were what she feared, and so whatever mishaps came her way, she always tried her best to interpret them with a generous light. That afternoon she had not been herself, but she had still managed to present a resolute front. Following along behind the administrative section chief, she went into a courtyard and then entered the cave where she would be living. It was the exact opposite of what she had been hoping for. Too big, it didn't get enough sun, and was sure to be damp. She stepped into the broad center of the cave. A frightful chill stole up on her from all sides. Where was the weak rays of the setting sun? Upon the black dirt walls, a layer of cold, mournful, lonely light seemed to be floating in the air. It was as if she had been placed in a world that was dark yet translucent. She seemed to have left reality. Then she saw her small leather carrying case and her bedroll lying bleakly on the cold ground. Section Chief Lee was a kind-hearted man, and he began making up her narrow-legged bed. But when he shook out her quilt, which was no thicker than a pancake, he could not restrain himself. "Your quilt is so thin," he exclaimed. Even among the troops he had seldom seen one so flimsy. She glanced around the large cave, a twinge of uncertainty pulling at her heart. Yet not wanting to ask for anything from someone else, she said simply, "I don't mind the cold that much." Opposite her bed was another one that was already neatly made up. Lee told her that it was for a nurse who was the wife of Dr. Chang. This news shattered her dream of living in the kind, quiet, clean, orderly life that comes from living alone. Struggling to comfort herself, she responded, "If I am to live in such a large cave, I ought to have a roommate." At that moment, the administrative section chief did something that brought the whole bed down. Quickly, he strode out the cave, probably in search of a hatchet. The young woman squatted down on the floor to see about repairing the bed herself. As she looked around for a tool to use, an old pine table in front of the window caught her eye. If it hadn't been leaning against something, it would have never stayed up. Next to the table, 2 benches lay haphazardly on the ground. It seemed as though the furniture in this recently opened hospital was just remnants and cast-offs dragged in from all over. How was she to pass this boring time now that the section chief was gone? There was nothing better to do than stroll out into the courtyard. In the courtyard there was a manure pile and a haystack close together that one could not find room to step between them. The 2 women, completely covered with chaff, were kneeling in the hay. One held a lever shears, the other grasped the bundles, and with undivided attention they cut the hay and mixed it with cow dung to make fertilizer. The young woman stood one side and watched them for a while. Then she asked in a friendly way, "How are you, neighbors?" "Fine," the 2 women answered. Stopping their work, they stared at her curiously until one of them finally remarked, "Another one come to have a baby." This woman had short hair that was sticking out in all directions. In the midst of that straw-like chaos, there was a pale face that looked like a piece of worn cloth. Her listless eyes had no more expression than a fish's. "No, I'm not here to have a baby. I'm here to deliver babies," the young woman replied, as with any woman who had never married, when she was mistaken for an expectant mother rather than a midwife. She felt disgust so great that she was on the verge of vomiting, as if she had just swallowed a fly. By now, faint, pale yellow lamplight was shining out of the 3 caves which faced eastward, and the bawling of a newborn baby could be heard. This gentle, comforting cry of a small life was most familiar and brought through the limitless freshness to her breast. She opened her mouth slightly, raised her eyebrows, and faced the rooms with their lighted lamps, and said lovingly, Tomorrow I start." While she had been walking outside, the glow of twilight had descended. The grove of trees along the watercourse was an indistinct blur. The distant hills wore a belt of gray, and above them colored clouds drifted across the sky. Although there was no wind to speak of, the air was bone-chilling. She had to return to her room. She was startled to see that the lamp had already been lit in her room, and she ran back quickly. When had the administrative section chief come back? Perhaps her bed had been repaired. When she entered the room, however, she saw only a female comrade in black clothing sitting on the bed that was already made up. She had lit the hempseed oil lamp and was polishing her shoes. The benches had been replaced one on top of the other, and the lamp sat on top of them. "Are you Lu Ping, the doctor that just arrived?" the woman in the room asked, as openly and as naturally as if she were accustomed to seeing her every day. She cast a casual glance her way, then returned to polishing her shoes. continuing to hum a strange song. She paid no heed whatever the joy that the newly arrived Lu Ping was showing. She answered her questions and comments with commonplace expressions. She was like an experienced traveler. She didn't care whether or not there was someone sleeping in the bed opposite hers. If someone different came along, it was all the same. Nothing could excite her interest. After a final look at her shoes, she pulled back the quilt and did not go to sleep. Instead, she sat there inside the covers with her back against the wall and began to sing a song from northern Shensi. Lu Ping once again picked up the wooden bed supports. She knocked and pounded, but no matter what she tried, they could not be set right. Finally, she had no choice but to spread her bedroll on the floor and resolve that she would somehow get through this one night. She took to a seat inside her covers and aimlessly took the measure of Dr. Chang's wife. Dr. Chang's wife was really pretty, wasn't she? Her head and her face were properly formed. Her black hair was neither too thick or too thin. Her eyes, nose, ears, and mouth were all just right. Her neck and shoulder blades fit together well. Maybe she would be a good subject for putting on canvas. Yet she seemed to have no emotion. There was neither a gentleness or a ferocity about her. There was nothing about her to indicate intelligence, but neither did she appear to be stupid. She had answered several of Lu Ping's questions and had spoken in some detail, and even raised certain questions of her own. But there was no way of telling whether she enjoyed this or really found it all unpleasant. Suddenly, it was as if Nurse Chang had been jabbed by a needle. She leaped out of bed and rushed out of the room. Lu Ping heard her push the door to the next room, say a few words, go in, obviously in high spirits. Her quilt, which had stirred up quite a breeze as she rushed out, now lay mostly on the floor. Once again, Lu Ping was alone. Her quilt hard to wrap up tightly, the lamp was running out of oil, and the remaining light was cold and cheerless. The rats were beginning to come out. At first they stayed under the bed opposite her, but as time passed, they came over and jumped on her quilt. She curled up inside her covers, not daring to take off her clothes. The cold made it hard to fall asleep, and many things kept coming into her mind. Thinking about what had happened just that afternoon could have occupied her for a whole dark night. With all her power, she comforted herself, encouraged herself, and scolded herself. Once again, she constructed a new tower of hope. She tried to fall asleep within that tower, but in the cattle shelter across from her cave, the cattle were endlessly chewing hay and constantly kicking something or other with their hooves. After a while, Lu Ping opened her eyes to find the room pitch black. The lamp had failed some time before, and now the rats were even braver. They were coming up to her head. Much later, Lu Ping heard the door of adjoining cave open, and the doctor's wife come storming back. She opened the door with a crash, bumped into one of the benches, stepped on her quilt. Those dog-fucking, motherfucking administrators, she cursed loudly. So stingy with the oil. As soon as it was lit, it's gone. The rotten motherfuckers. She spit these extreme vulgarities one after another in familiar manner. She learned them well from the soldiers. However, even as she swore, it did not appear that she was really angry or that her words were really meant to be so obscene. Lu Ping didn't make a sound, but as she moistened her lips, she tasted something deeply satisfying. As for the nurse, she began snoring rhythmically as soon as she laid her head on the pillow. Lu Ping had graduated from a school of obstetrics in Shanghai in accordance with her father's wishes. She had left after the first 2 years of study that she was not cut out to be an obstetrician. She had more enthusiasm for literature. There were even times when she felt a hatred of all doctors. However, she still completed 4 full years of study. The Japanese attack on Shanghai on August 13th, 1937, brought her into the war, and she went to serve in a battle hospital. She patiently bathed the wounded soldiers and changed their dressings. She wrote letters home for them and often ran off to get something they needed. She looked after them like a mother or a girlfriend, and they relied on her as if she were too. After their wounds healed, she felt happy for them. When they left, some talked about seeing her again, and she did receive a number of letters of appreciation, but then there would be no more news. As this happened, she would quietly gather in her lonely feelings and turn them toward new arrivals. For almost a whole year she lived this drifting life. She endured a great many hardships before she turned away and ran off to Yan'an, where at last she became a student of the Resistance University. At Resistance University, Lu Ping experienced a change of heart. She applied herself diligently to reading a variety of books that she had never come in contact with before. She studied public speaking. She seemed to see her future as that of a vigorous political worker. She was very young, only 20 years old, and felt confident about her own intelligence. She was satisfied with this life and where she was going. She was careful with her time and didn't waste her feelings on those who wouldn't reciprocate. After living at Resistance University for a year, Lu Ping became a member of the Communist Party. At the same time, the director of the political department sought her out and told her that the needs of the party dictated that she leave her studies and go to a recently opened hospital some 20 miles from Yan'an. He also told her that medical work should become her vocation, her means of making a lifelong contribution to the party. Lu Ping argued against this. She said her character was not suited to such work. She said she would do anything else, no matter whether it was important. She even cried. None of her arguments, however, could sway the director in his determination. Since she could not overturn the decision, there was nothing to do but obey. The party branch secretary came to discuss this matter with her, and a cell leader talked with her for a full day. Lu Ping did not care for all this talk. She understood all the reasons for the action. It was just that they wanted her to cut away the bright future that she had been dreaming about for the past year. They wanted her to return to her old life. She knew that she could never be a great doctor. She was nothing more than an ordinary midwife. Her presence, she felt, would probably not make any difference at all. Lu Ping was a person full of illusions who had the endurance to break out of the circumstances of her life. But now the iron hoops of the party and the needs of the party were around her. Could she go against a party directive? Could she ignore these iron hoops, these bonds that she herself had put on? There was nothing to do but go, but she agreed only a year. Then she swept away her old mood and went out happily to meet her new life. Had it not Lenin said, "Being happy is the greatest insult to life"? That was how Lu Ping came to the hospital. The hospital's superintendent was a Genoese of peasant stock. After joining the revolution, he had served long in the military. Medical work was completely foreign to him. He welcomed Lu Ping as if he felt that female comrades needed no respect or politeness, and read her letter of introduction as indifferently as he would look at a hay purchase receipt. After taking a long look at her, he declared, "Well, very good. You'll be staying here." He indicated that he was too busy to talk longer with her and suggested that she look for a political advisor in the room across the hall. Having said that, he didn't look at her again. He just sat there, not lifting a finger to do anything. The political advisor, Comrade Huang Shou-jung, looked like a company commander in the youth corps of the 8th Root Army. He was cautious, but he also loved very much to talk. His clothes were neat, and he exuded a sense of sincere youthful enthusiasm. He was somewhat shy, but he tried to act with great dignity. Huang Shuyang told Lu Ping about the hospital's problems. First, they had no money. Second, they had just moved into the area. Because they hadn't yet established a good relationship with the masses, it was difficult to mobilize people. Third, there weren't enough doctors. Finally, and those charge of things had all come from other areas that were hard to deal with. Huang told her about his past, how he once served as a political advisor to an army company, how he wished he could return there. After she left the political advisor's office, in the course of the day, Lu Ping met several of her colleagues. Lin Xia, a woman in chemical analysis laboratory, gave her a hostile glance right at the start. Lin Xia had thin, slanting eyes that closed into half circles when she laughed. The corners would drop, the lids would puff up slightly, and a delicate, enticing brilliance would reveal itself. She seemed to be wanting to be loved, asking people, "Look, aren't I pretty?" But when she looked at Lu Ping, there was only disdain in her eyes, as if to say, where did they drag this midwife from? She looks like a pauper. Lin Xia's face had many expressions. Sometimes she was like a flower smiling. At other times she was like a cold star in the dead of night. She carried herself well when she walked and spoke in a slow rhythm that was haughty but attractive. Lu Ping could do nothing but smile innately at her, at the same time thinking, "Why should I fear you? How dare you get arrogant with me? I'll make you sit up and take notice." Lu Ping believed that she could do it, and she wanted to very much. One of Lu Ping's former classmates at the Resistance University, Chang Fangsu, was in the hospital working as a cultural instructor. Lu Ping had never felt anything special for this girl, who liked very much to sing songs in front of others. Chang Fangsu was very good at frittering away her days. Her character was gentle, and she would never refuse any kind of arms extended to her. Yet she had few friends. This was not because she was peculiar or anything like that. Rather, it was because she seemed to lack any backbone at all. Like a rotting piece of cotton cloth, she had no strength and could not hold the interest of others. When Lu Ping first caught a glimpse of her former classmate, a wave of happiness rose up in her heart. But as she looked again with that vulgar, flat face, her heart became calm and cool, as if it had just sunk deep in the ocean. Lu Ping's next stop was the director of obstetrics, Dr. Wang Sohua. Dr. Wang's wife, a pediatrician, had the air of a woman completely immersed in her church. She looked at everything around her as a white man regards a colored man. She was like an immortal banished to this mortal world, at once compassionate and condescending. Her husband, however, made a more favorable impression on Lu Ping. He was a middle-aged man with the air of gentry about him. His complexion was ruddy, his voice clear, and he maintained a constant level of satisfaction towards his work. Although Lu Ping recognized in him a variety of the vain manners cultivated by the bourgeoisie, she also noticed that he was energetic and had some real enthusiasm for what he was doing. Lu Ping did not particularly care for this kind of person, nor did she need such a person for a friend. But as far as work was concerned, she would be happy to cooperate with someone like this. However, sitting there with that icy wife of his on one side made her so nervous that she did not dare to stay too long. Although Dr. Wang's manner was friendly and open, she still felt an inexpressible pressure. And these various matters disturbed and worried her, but after a night's sleep, Lu Ping brushed them off like dust from her sleeve. Having made a reasoned assessment of the whole situation, she bounced back again with great vitality. She felt that she had enough energy to take on any challenge, and called to herself, "Let my new life begin." Every morning after breakfast, when there was nothing special to do, Lu Ping made a round of 5 obstetrics wards without waiting for the head doctor. The great majority of patients were women from northern Shensi, with a scattering of students from a number of places. All of them welcomed her warmly. Each one looked at her with careful eyes. They called her name cordially and asked questions about their illnesses. At times, as women are prone to do, they showed a flare of temper, but all of them entrusted their hopes to Lu Ping. At first, one might find such trust and confidence exciting as well as flattering, except for certain things that went on day after day. For one thing, the women didn't do as she told them. They seemed afraid of becoming sick, but they didn't care about cleanliness. They used unsterilized paper, refused to let the nurses bathe them, and less than 3 days after giving birth, they would begin to creep quietly out of bed and go to the toilet by themselves. They were a stubborn lot. They had all become mothers, but they wanted others to treat them like children. Every day, Lu Ping repeated her requests to them. At times, she pretended to be angry, but the rooms remained as dirty as before. The nurses and attendants were uneducated, and everything was just piled in corners. The laundrymen did not come regularly, and the used cotton and gauze could be seen all over the courtyard. Since flies that had not yet died of the cold were finding nourishment there, Lu Ping had no choice but to put on her face mask, wrap a towel around her head, and pick up a broom to sweep the courtyard herself. Some patients, a passerby, and even a nurse or two stood by and watched. It wasn't long before they returned to the courtyard to its original appearance without the slightest thought of remorse. Besides, the wife of Dr. Chung, the wife of the business manager in some other organization, was also working in the hospital. Both of them were nurses in the obstetrics ward. Having studied nursing for some 3 months, they were able to recognize a number of characters and about a dozen names of Chinese medicines. However, they had no interest in nursing and didn't really know what they were doing. Yet they had to work. A new fear was pressuring them. Groups of female students were coming to Yan'an from other parts of China, and divorce cases were rampant. Of course, there were instances of women who had really awakened and were willing to work hard to achieve independent lives. But for the most part, there was only fear and confusion. These two wives really put on airs, especially the wife of the business manager, who was 26 or 27 years old. This woman wore a Sun Yat-sen style of uniform that she had made herself, placed the kind of hair clips used by young maidens in her thinning hair. Thinking herself attractive, she strutted arrogantly about the courtyard with her stomach bulging. These two women had no desire whatsoever to serve others. They were lazy. They were dirty. They showed enthusiasm only when they were patching their shoes or socks or starching their clothes. Lu Ping had no choice but to put the pressure on them, and when that failed to get results, she had to do their work for them. Because she was apprehensive about their performance, she watched them sterilize instruments and checked on them as they bathed and changed the babies and made cotton balls and gauze rolls. Since she didn't want those who were sick or near term to suffer pain, she personally changed the dressings for several who had had operations or who had infections. This kind of habitual moral sense was not in vogue, but in more than a few people looked down on her. However, she had developed the habit as a very young child. Lu Ping was always a little happier in the afternoon, or to put it another way, she became happier when there were no women in labor and her time was comparatively free. She would attend meetings and bring up many ideas that she had written down the night before. She was enthusiastic enough, but she had little understanding of the ways of the world. She was forever talking, arguing, or reiterating unreasonable things that she had seen each day. Lu Ping didn't realize what expressions meant which she saw on the faces of other people. She brought up all sorts of things that many others did not dare or did not wish to mention themselves. She did receive some support. A few doctors and nurses often sought her out for a talk. The patients were especially supportive. They had heard that she was looking out for their welfare and arguing with many people about improving their treatment. They all had great sympathy for her. Lu Ping, however, had by now become the little eccentric of the hospital, and there was no doubt that the majority considered her unusual. As a matter of fact, Lu Ping's ideas had already been accepted by everyone as good. It was not completely impossible to implement them either. It was just that they were too new and different. In comparison with the life that had become normal, they seemed peculiar. Still, the main argument against Lu Ping's ideas was a lack of personnel and materials. Lu Ping cared nothing for such reasons. When someone entered the obstetrics ward, she would point out problems, exclaiming, "Look, The equipment is so poor. The only syringe has a bent needle, and the doctors in the hospital's superintendent tell us to learn how to use bent needles. The rubber gloves are torn, though that there's no use talking about them. They can't very well be prepared, but it would be possible to burn an extra 2 or 3 caddies of charcoal. How can a room be good for expectant mothers and newborn babies when it's cold? She would take people through the patient's room and let them see why nurses who lacked an education were unsatisfactory. By her description, the patients' lives were like a form of punishment. Lu Ping wanted the patients to have clean quilts and clothing, a warm room, nourishing food, and an ordered life. She was requested picture books, magazines, and papers for them. She wanted informal social discussion groups, small recreational meetings in the evening, and more. All who heard her speak listened with great enthusiasm, but later they never reacted with more than a laugh. Lu Ping was not completely without support, though. She did have 2 close friends. She and a girl named Hsia had established a solid friendship in their very first conversation. This young assistant in the surgery department was also from the south, but she seemed to be tougher, less complicated, and more experienced than Lu Ping. Together they discussed the past, present, and future, especially the future. They wove the same kinds of beautiful fantasies. They discussed everyone in the hospital, and they were surprised to find their ideas so similar. They never, however, stopped to analyze why this is so. Besides Hsia, Lu Ping had become friends with Cheng Peng, a doctor in the surgery department who often wrote short stories and plays. In the operating room, however, he was a tight-lipped professional. He forbade any extra moves and had a strict look and actually frightened some people. He hardly spoke at all and used his hands instead to get his message across. In leisure conversations, however, there was no stopping him. He had a great knack for describing things in detail. Whenever Lu Ping was worn out by her work, or whenever she felt inexplicable pressures from her job or her surroundings, she was always overwhelmed by an indescribable feeling of despondency. However, when these 2 friends came by, she was able to pour out her feelings. She could be more pointed and even exaggerate a little because she did not need to fear that they would misunderstand her, twist her words, fault her, or betray her. Her vexations would dissipate, and they would begin to plan how to improve the hospital environment and make their work more relevant to actual conditions. Both her friends cautioned her about getting too excited. Excessive zeal, untempered by reason, they warned, would end in nothing. The 3 of them also discussed the latest hospital gossip. For instance, who was Hsia finally going to fall in love with? Would it be the superintendent of the hospital, the director of surgery, or perhaps someone else? None of them liked it when stories going around the hospital became too numerous or malicious, and at times they suspected that someone was deliberately trying to damage the authority of the superintendent. In fact, they frequently wound up to defending both him and Hsia, even though their hearts, all 3 of them, disliked this woman and her phony cordiality. And none of them felt any respect for the superintendent. This was especially true of Lu Ping, who always felt that she needed to guard herself against Hsia, for she couldn't explain why. One of the biggest stories circulating through the hospital was about Cheng Fang-su, whom the political advisor's wife had slapped in the face. She had also complained directly to the Ministry of Health, with the result that Cheng Fang-su was transferred to a dispensary at an army base. Meanwhile, everyone in the hospital was speculating that she wouldn't last long there either, because the same thing was likely to happen again. Since all the people at the hospital were being kept very busy, were constantly being exhorted to improve their skills, and had so many meetings to attend, it was a good question why anyone still had so much free time to talk about things like who's in love with whom, who is and who isn't a party member. If a person isn't a member of the party, why not? There must be a problem there. By this time, Lu Ping herself was at the topic of idle chatter, no longer because of her various suggestions. She had said many things about the hospital system and its operation, and from the start there had been those who accused her of wanting to run things, of being a zealot, and of loving being the center of attention. But that kind of criticism had gradually become routine, and no one paid much attention to it. Even if Lu Ping's remarks did make people react, they weren't beyond forgiveness, and certainly insufficient cause for spreading spiteful gossip about her. Now, however, the situation was different. For some reason or other, people were pointing at her behind her back. Even the patients lying in the bed picked up various rumors and began to steal glances at her with eyes full of curiosity. As sensitive as Lu Ping was, she didn't get the slightest hint of what was going on. She continued eagerly to take care of the expectant mothers and infants. For the sake of their smallest needs, she argued that the administrative section and the business section, the secretary general, and even with the hospital superintendent himself. Wearing a short cotton garment tied tightly about her, she ran from one place to another in the cold wind. Her face became swollen with cold. The skin on her heels cracked open, but Lu Ping never grumbled. The nights were the worst of all. Most of the time she could not get a full night's sleep because the woman had waited until night to give birth. There were times when she was called at midnight. The two nurses were easily frightened, were afraid to go out in the dark alone. It was left for her to go through the bone-chilling night to fetch water from the kitchen. In the delivery room, a small brazier of burning charcoal notwithstanding, her hands were often stiff with cold inside her rubber gloves. She would be extremely nervous, but she dared not let it show. If there were no complications, she would handle the delivery herself. The doctor in charge lived quite far away, and she didn't want to rouse him on such cold nights. Lu Ping's enthusiasm for service extended beyond her own work. She wanted to experience and others' skills too. Thus she had the good fortune to be free when Cheng Peng was operating. She always went to observe. In her opinion, surgery was of the utmost necessity in the time of war, and if she really had to do medical work, if there were no other choice, then being a surgeon would be far preferable to being a midwife. If she were a surgeon, she could go to the front. She could busily rush through the forest of guns and the rain of bullets. Yes, she had always wanted to be on the move. Lu Ping was forever dissatisfied with the present. Recently, she had heard that Cheng Peng was about to perform a major operation. She was now in the midst of ensuring that she wouldn't miss this opportunity. The thoughts of what Hsia had told her the evening before awakened Lu Ping before dawn. Of course, the combination of her thin quilt and the especially cold temperatures that occurred just before sunrise often woke her up. Today, however, she couldn't go back to sleep. The pale light coming through the paper window illuminated everything in the cave. Lu Ping looked enviously at Dr. Cheng's wife sleeping on the other bed. She always slumbered peacefully through the night like a child who had exhausted himself playing during the day. She and Lu Ping were among the youngest in the hospital. Lu Ping's work was tiring, but all she needed was a good night's sleep. She recalled that in the past she would sometimes wake up at night, but she would always feel so drowsy that after turning over she would fall right back to sleep. Being unable to sleep, however, did have its advantages. As Lu Ping stared at the plain white window paper, she thought of many things. They were unimportant things, things that otherwise she would have not had time for, but thinking of them gave her a great deal of pleasure. Her mind went back to the southern plains with their green grass. She saw the streams, the villages, all the great trees that she could name. She thought of the courtyard in her old home and of her mother, brothers, and sisters. Did cooking smoke still rise over the rooftops? Was the house still there? What happened to all those people? She recalled her childhood friends and wondered whether they had gone away. Lu Ping had heard that some of her friends had joined the guerrillas, and for a moment she dreamed of doing that someday. In her reverie, she took a deep breath of air scented by wildflowers, grass, and trees. The old folks at home embraced her. How she longed to be able to see her mother again. It would soon be 3 years since she had left home. She was tougher now, but in a secret spot, she still felt a need for her mother's love and comfort. Outside the window, snowflakes silently floated down, covering the path that had been swept clean yesterday. A chorus of roosters nearby and from a distance could be heard, ushering in a new day. As the sound of a trumpet practice carried faintly into the room, Lu Ping's thoughts turned to the question, how can the operating room be satisfactory without a coal stove? She was annoyed with the hospital superintendent. All he understood was enduring hardship. He didn't understand that certain basic conditions had to be met in medical work. Lu Ping was also angry at the director of surgery. Why didn't he insist a coal stove be installed? Cheng Peng ought to say something too. That was their responsibility. If they failed once or twice, they should try again. Very upset, Lu Ping crawled out of bed, quietly started a fire, lit the lamp, and wrote an entreating letter to the superintendent. She also wrote a note to Hsia telling her to go out and do some talking in favor of the idea. She said that herself would not be able to get away from the obstetrics ward all morning. By the time Lu Ping finished, it was broad daylight and she was getting nervous. She hoped that no one would go into labor that afternoon. She was happily looking forward to seeing the operation. Hsia neither came to see Lu Ping nor returned her note. She was busy preparing all the things that would be needed that afternoon in the operating room. If even a single item was missing, and it affected the patient's life, the responsibility would be hers alone. Because of this, she had to arrange the entire room, sterilize everything, and put everything in order for easy use. She was apportioned the work between two nurses and told them which areas should be given special attention. She dared not take a single thing for granted. Cheng Peng came by to check things over. Have you seen Lu Ping's letter? Hsia asked, handing him the note she had received that morning. I think no matter what we do, it's impossible to take care of this today. It's so late. That's why I haven't done what she suggested. However, if it is too cold, we could delay the operation for a few days. It's your decision. Cheng Peng folded the note and returned it to Hsia without a word. Wrinkles seized his brow as he walked over to inspect the scalpels and scissors that had been laid out. The delicate metal instruments had a harsh, cold shine, but to him they were familiar and dear. After looking them over, he nodded to Hsia as if to say, very good. At times like this, their relationship was strictly professional. He ordered and she obeyed. He didn't permit her the slightest trace of mischievousness she displayed when they were acting as friends. Finally, on his way out, he said, please have everything ready by 2 o'clock, and light one more brazier. The patient cannot wait for me to install a stove. Immediately after lunch, Lu Ping rushed over to the surgery department building. By now, Hsia was infected with Cheng Peng's silence and seriousness, and all she told Li Peng was that the patient could not wait for the stove to be put in the place. Then she noticed that several people were already in the operating room, and suddenly felt a certain pressure in the atmosphere. Without saying another word, she walked over and put on her sterilized cap. A small piece of shrapnel from a bomb had exploded 2 months earlier and lodged in the patient's abdomen below his ribs. 12 fragments had already been removed, and only this fragment remained. They tried to find it once before without success. This would be his second attempt. Because of the nutritious diet he had recently, the patient seemed fairly strong. He walked into the operating room on his own and decided to have his appendix out too. However, as soon as he sat down at the edge of the table, color drained from his face. There was a fear and weariness in his eyes as he looked at this group of people dressed in white. His voice quivering, he stammered out the question, how many hours? It'll go very fast, someone replied, but Lu Ping knew that doctors never tell patients the truth. For convenience, Cheng Peng wore only a wool shirt under his gown. Hsia also went without a cotton jacket. Everyone's actions were sincere and as careful as if they were conducting a religious ceremony. The patient lay down, and they bathed him in a medical lotion. Lu Ping could see an old wound, an inch-long scar. Cheng Peng motioned to her, and she realized that he wanted her to help the nurses measure out the drops of anesthetic. The odor of chloroform immediately entered her nostrils, but it didn't matter. She received only a slight whiff, while the patient, who had been counting, quickly fell silent. Lu Ping watched as Cheng Peng plotted, cut, and folded the skin back in a well-practiced manner. With pieces of gauze, he swiftly wiped away the blood that was flowing out and changed instruments in rapid procession. Hsia handed him each one without the slightest confusion. The knife blade cut for 1.5 inches, and the doctor gently drew out some red things and some other things that were bluish-green. Pushing his forceps into the incision, he felt around for a single piece of steel that was hidden so deeply inside. In spite of the 3 braziers full of charcoal, the room was still extremely cold. Lu Ping worried constantly about the anesthetized patient, whose internal organs were exposed. Afraid to take her eyes off him for an instant, she kept a steady watch on his breathing and his reactions. Once again the doctor pressed downward, listened, and folded open several more things that were all twisted together. A slight wisp of steam floated upward from the incision. Almost half an hour had gone by. Lu Ping cast a worried glance at Chang Peng's direction, but he didn't even look at her. He was pulling the scalpel upward and beginning to search nearer the ribs. Blood still flowed at times, but Chang Peng wiped it away as he had before. By now the patient's face was paler. Lu Ping was afraid that he was getting cold, and suddenly herself began to feel dizzy. The door to the operating room was tightly closed, and there were 3 braziers of charcoal were burning brightly inside. Lu Ping looked at the time and began to get nervous. 3/4 of an hour had passed. There were 7 people shut up in this unventilated room. How could they stand it? At last, the piece of coal was plucked out again with the tiniest forceps. It was the size of a grain of rice. Only a small area of flesh around it had given way to pus. With this work done, Chang Peng went about cutting out the appendix. Lu Ping's head was swimming, but somehow she held on. Hsia, however, suddenly fell against the operating table and became still. She had been in the room too long. Carbon dioxide had taken its toll. Carry her out into the cold courtyard, Chang Peng told the 2 nurses. In an instant, the other 2 doctors assumed her responsibilities. As Lu Ping watched Hsia being carried out like a corpse, tears welled up and filled her eyes. She didn't know whether Hsia would live or die. All she could think about was going with her to see how she was. But she also realized that she was handling another person's life. She couldn't leave. Chang Peng's movements became more rapid, but before he had finished, Lu Ping couldn't stand any longer and began to moan. "Help her to the door and leave a crack open," Chang Peng said. Lu Ping lay down just outside the doorway, and as her mind cleared a bit, she waved her hand and shouted, "Go back in, go back, he can't do it all himself." Left alone outside the door, Lu Ping thought of going to see Hsia. She began to crawl away from the operating room. But the 2 nurses were returning, pulled her back to the door, and left her there. She didn't move. Snowflakes flew onto her face. Shivers ran up and down her body. Her teeth chattered. Her head seemed about to burst. Lu Ping didn't know how long she had been asleep when she heard some people walk past and realized they were carrying the patient back to his room. She thought of how late it was, and how she ought to be going back to her room to sleep. However, she also thought again of going to see Hsia. What if something happened to Hsia? Oh, she's so young, she thought. The cold wind had already made her mind clear, but a strange sense of exhilaration and weakness controlled her. She rushed unsteadily across the snow-covered ground. The wind howled at her. Dusk was falling. Melting snow and tears mixed together and covered her face. Is this how she is going to give up her life? She cried out, "Her mother doesn't know anything about what's happening." Lu Ping couldn't find Hsia, so she ran back to her own cave. She knew full well that she needed to sleep and sleep, but something was crushing her. She had to scream. While Lu Ping shivered under 3 or 4 quilts, patients crowded into her room made guesses at what was wrong with her. At 11 o'clock, Chang Peng came to see her and gave her a sedative. That afternoon, his head had been as dizzy as hers, but he somehow kept control and finished the operation. Then he had gone to a deserted, snow-covered slope and sat there for an hour while his head cleared. After this he had come back, drunk some hot water, and gone to see Hsia. She was sleeping soundly. After eating a little more, he had brought the medicine and come to see Lu Ping. Knowing that a friend was beside her made Lu Ping feel weaker than ever. She was unable to keep from crying. She just wished that she could see her mother. If she could collapse on her mother's breast and cry her heart out, everything would be all right. Changpeng did not leave until he had helped Lu Ping take her medicine. Even she herself had no idea when she finally fell asleep. The next day she was still in bed when Li Ya came to see her. She told Li Ya that she seemed to have lost interest in everything. All she felt like doing was lying in bed and not moving. Lu Ping stayed in her room as if she were ill, but gossip about her flew in all directions throughout the hospital. No two stories were alike. Some said that she was in love with Changpeng and had gone crazy that night and was still suffering from lovesickness. Others said that the party could not endorse their love because Changpeng was not a party member and his background was unclear. Lu Ping could not possibly pay attention to such things. Her mind was in a state of utter confusion. The reality of life was too frightening for her. She wondered why so many people had walked by her prostrate body that night without a single offer to help. She thought about the willingness of the hospital superintendent to endanger patients, doctors, and nurses in order to save a little money. She examined her daily life and wondered what use it was to the revolution. The revolution was for all mankind. Why then were even the closest comrades lacking in love? Lu Ping was so unsure of herself. She asked herself if her support of the revolution was wavering. Once again, in nervous exhaustion she had suffered in the past took hold of her. Night after night she suffered from insomnia. Meanwhile, people in the party branch were criticizing her. Labels such as petty bourgeoisie mentality, intellectual heroism, and liberalism were pinned on her. The general conclusion was that her sense of party loyalty was weak. The superintendent of the hospital called her in and gave her a talking to. The patients cooled in their attitude toward her and said she was loose. Lu Ping had felt that yes, she should struggle, but against whom? Against everyone? If she didn't fight this out with them, she should leave. It wasn't right to stay here and upset people. Yet, where could she go? She wished with all her might that she could stand up and go somewhere she wanted to. She was seeking the determination she had felt when she had arrived, but everything was moving in the wrong direction. All she could do was sit in her cave all day, frowning and brooding. Changpeng and Li Ya wondered why she had suddenly become so weak. They came by often to talk with her and tried to ease her frustration. This, however, led to more gossip, and finally even the political advisor came to believe the rumors. He told her formally that love could not be permitted to obstruct one's work. Such talk left Lu Ping feeling shocked and insulted, but also stirred her anger. As if seeking revenge, she looked everywhere for weak points to attack. She criticized everything. Every day she thought about how she could assail the others and bring them down. She believed firmly that truth was on her side. A new strength seemed to be supporting Lu Ping. Whenever she had a free moment, she went to as many rooms as possible, gathering comments to use in support of her accusations. One day she went to room number 6, where a malaria patient with no feet was staying. Without waiting for her to speak, he motioned for her to sit down, and with a sense of closeness that one finds among kin, said, "Comrade, I've been in the hospital for 2 weeks, and ever since I heard people talk about you, and I've been wanting to meet you. You've come just at the right time. Please don't be polite, for you have to excuse me for talking to you like this. I've got to lean on something, since both my feet are gone." "Why is that?" "The medical work was poor and unskilled. For no good reason, they sawed off both my feet." "When did this happen?" 3 years ago. At that time there were many nights when I considered killing myself." Lu Ping was at a loss of how to comfort him. "I really can't stand any more of this. What kind of monstrosity is this hospital?" "Comrade, now things are better. Come here and look at the few lice I have on my body. When I came here before, because of my feet, the lice almost ate me up. You say that the hospital superintendent is no good, but do you know anything about his background? He was an illiterate peasant. The political advisor was a young herdsboy. He grew up in the military. How much can he know? Yes, they are all unsatisfactory, but who can take their places? I tell you that their superiors are no different. Your knowledge is greater than theirs. You are more able to assume responsibilities than they are. However, oil, salt, firewood, and rice have to be obtained from somewhere. Can you make them? The work style must be changed, but is it so easy? You're a good person. You have a fine character. I could see it in your face the moment you came in. but you don't have an overall strategy. You're too young. Don't be impatient. Go slowly. If you have any problems, come and talk them over. But by the way, making formal accusations is good too. It always serves some purpose. He chuckled as he looked at Lu Ping's astonished expression. Who are you? How can you see everything so clearly? If I had met you earlier, things would be different now. Everyone understands this. Go and ask the cook. Who do you think told me these things? Who do you think told me about you? They know everything. You should talk things over with them more often. Don't just look to a few people. If you do, your energy will drain away, and it won't be easy to keep going in the midst of fierce self-struggle. Lu Ping felt that this man was really unusual, and she didn't leave. He talked to her about many things, as if she were his younger brother or sister, including what seemed to be the cruel struggles of life. He explained, encouraged, and patiently taught her. He learned that she had been a student and had gone to the Soviet Union. Now, because he was crippled, he was editing popular readers for soldiers. She shed tears for him, but he seemed to be detached from his own situation. After a few days, the Ministry of Health called Lu Ping for a discussion. She didn't make any accusations. Instead, she explained herself several times. As thoroughly investigated, she had the good fortune of being understood. Moreover, her request to continue her studies was approved. When Lu Ping left the hospital, the ice had not yet begun to melt, but the sting had already gone from the wind that touched her face. As she went away, her heart felt as if it were really springtime. She was reluctant to leave Liya and Changpeng, but there was nothing she could do but pass them on what the man without feet had told her. A new life was beginning for Lu Ping, but there were still trials ahead. People, like iron, must pass through numerous tempering fires before their real worth can be proven. A person matures amidst hardship.